Good evening, everyone. My name is Ruz Al-Yabadi with WholeRen Education. This meeting is on the records for your information. We're live on Periscope, so our other colleagues are watching us from different offices. We are grateful to close 2017 WholeRen Talk with a great speaker, a dear friend, and a colleague, Aaron Goldblatt. I will introduce him in a second for some housekeeping items. This presentation should last about 25 to 30 minutes, and I'm going to open it up for some conversations. I also asked Aaron to give us his perspective about our industry, the education industry, international education industry. So with that, let me introduce you Aaron Goldblatt. Aaron Goldblatt is a political and economic researcher, management consultant, international business professional with a background in using data-driven insights to inform organizational strategies. He has worked with private sector companies and government agencies in the past, and currently engage with organizations to provide them with solutions to better utilize large data sets and machine learnings to solve complex business problems. His current research focuses on emerging trends in technology and how they and other global forces will shape the world in the years to come. He holds a master's degree in international relations and international economics from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and a bachelor's in finance and history from University of Pennsylvania.
Penn State.
I'm sorry, Pennsylvania State University. I apologize. The topic of today's WholeRen Talk is what Aaron calls it, creative destruction in the fourth industrial revolution. We have heard a lot about the fourth industrial revolution, but what I like about this presentation, Aaron will spend some time to go through where we have been, where we are, and where we're going. And frankly, what does it mean for us, both for our industry, our clients, our customer base, and frankly, the outlook in the not just the next decade, but next 2 or 3 decades as well. So without further ado, please join me and welcome Aaron to the last of 2017 series of Talks at WholeRen.
Great. Thank you. Good. So happy to be here. Thank you all for having me. Are you leaving me all by my lonesome self?
Yes, sir.
All right. So what I want to talk about today are some of the major technological developments happening currently and what that basically means for the future of the workforce. I'm going to do that by comparing it to a very similar but much more ancient event, which is the first industrial revolution. So to start, I've got on this slide just a highlight of some of the big major innovations in the last few years that I consider part of this fourth industrial revolution. Really, artificial intelligence, which is derived via machine learning, and big data being probably the 2 most important innovations. But others on here are very important as well, including robotics, autonomous driving, 3D printing, blockchain, which I think has the opportunity to really revolutionize many different sectors as well. So a lot of really major changes. These are the technologies that I consider as part of that fourth revolution. This is really just the fourth of 4 revolutions. The first being that which occurred in England. It began in England in the 18th and 19th century. We learned this in school: cotton factories, textiles, eventually railroads and other things. The second is what we can call the assembly line revolution, maybe. This is basically the development of products that could be produced on an assembly line in mass. Think your early automobiles, Ford's Model T Ford, for example. The third revolution is the digital revolution. This is what occurred really beginning in the 1980s with computers becoming more available for personal use, their use in the business, but also information technology like cell phones, the internet, things that have connected all of us around the world much more rapidly. Without these innovations, I could not be live right now. And then lastly, we're in what I call this fourth industrial revolution, which is really about artificial intelligence, data, Internet of Things, which is also crucial to data, quantum computing. But what's different about this one right now is that humans are the really most integral element of this. And this is because artificial intelligence, for example, really depends upon the large amounts of data being generated to teach different algorithms and different artificial intelligence platforms how to actually learn and function. And that data comes from us. So when you go on Amazon.com, Alibaba, whatever it might be, they're collecting all kinds of information about you individually, about what you like, how you buy things, how you click on pages, and that information is used to really inform a lot of these machine learning algorithms that can then give you better services in the future. So exciting time, but this one is very different. Now, all these innovations are exciting, they're great, they're making our lives better, but it's a bit complicated in the sense that productivity is up, there's more innovation than ever, things are going great, yet wages are stagnating, people are losing their jobs. And so there's this big question, which is this actually beneficial to society? Will we come out at the end of this on top, or will things maybe not look so good? And I think there's kind of two extremes of this perspective. The first being that this kind of disruption has always occurred. The Industrial Revolution, the Digital Revolution, this disruption occurred during those events as well. It's normal. The workforce, if you've lost a job or your wages have decreased, it'll eventually work itself out. It won't be so bad. People need to relax. The second is a much darker and dystopian version, I think, of our future, which is that these technologies are going to encroach on almost every aspect of our working lives, and ultimately we'll have a very small number of people who control businesses or who are the creatives, and everyone else will be unemployed. We'll have this kind of dystopian version of the future in which almost everyone's unemployed and very few people hold a lot of the power. I think both perspectives are a bit off. I'll go into why in a minute, but in order to do so, let's first set some expectations, which is we can't predict the future. No one really knows how these trends will play out exactly over time, but we can do a few things. We can look at the past and try and find similar events and compare those events to today and understand what is different and what is the same, and then what do those differences and similarities mean for our future. And so that's what I'm going to do today. So I will start with a little bit of history lesson. I'll go through this pretty quick, so as not to bore you all. But this is about the first industrial revolution began in England in the 18th century. Really the result of a culmination of a few important events, increase in agricultural productivity as a result of some major inventions, some important infrastructure investments in canals, roads, legal reforms that better protected property and investment, and innovative ideas like what we take for granted today when it comes to patents, all began in this time period, as well as the Enlightenment, which really spurred interest in science, in physics, chemicals, technology. This is where all this innovation came from. A few very important innovations here in the early Industrial Revolution. Really think back, this is 1733 when this first major innovation, the flying shuttle, was created, which really helped in the cotton weaving process. And a number of other inventions here, also very important. Steam engine is probably the most notable as well, helped to power a lot of factories. So what happened as these inventions were adopted in England, we had the creation of lots of mills, which could create textiles and other cotton goods at much lower price than had been done in the past and at much greater volume. At the same time, the agricultural improvements meant that more agricultural goods were being created than ever, with actually fewer hands that were needed. And so as a result, England's population boomed in the 19th century. Prior to this period, the population had never really gone above 6 million just because they could not produce enough food to feed more than that many people. But afterwards, you can see it skyrocketed. Nearly 40 million by the time World War I started. At the same time, the number of people working in agriculture declined dramatically. It went from about 35, some say as high as 50% before the Industrial Revolution started, to I think it looks like around 10% below that in the early 20th century. And all these people, they found jobs in industry. They were finding jobs in textiles. Again, as I mentioned, a lot of industrial costs plummeted as a result of machines. Cotton and textiles, the biggest one, but we really saw this in many other industries. There's a dark side of this as well, and this is kind of a parallel to today, which is that an entire class of people pretty much lost their livelihoods. And so prior to the Industrial Revolution, most manufacturing was done in small home workshops by apprentices, journeymen, and masters. And these basically are skilled artisans who over many years developed the skills necessary to create these products. But these products were also very, very expensive, right? Very labor intensive, required a lot of expertise and skill. They were out of reach of most of the population. But as industry came in and began to create products much more cheaply and at much greater scale, all of a sudden these guys found themselves without a job because they can no longer compete with the low-cost goods that were of the same or similar quality to what was happening, to what they were doing. And so many artisan industries actually collapsed in the early 19th century in England. There was a reaction to this, the most famous of which is the Rebellion of the Luddites, in which a group of artisans basically went into factories and smashed the machinery as kind of a protest to this new technology, hoping they could somehow stop the tide of progress. They ultimately failed. They were defeated by the British government. New laws were passed to protect property, and the inexorable march of industrial development continued. What I've got here is just a highlight of some of the major industries that were sprouted from the Industrial Revolution, not just textiles, but shipbuilding and iron making, laying railroad track, for example. Also, of course, legal services and financial services to service all of these very big, complex industries that were very new. What ended up happening was there was an explosion in jobs, millions of new jobs in different industries created, new types of industries became much more important, and agriculture became much less important. And so you can see here by the middle of the 19th century in England, nearly 40% of the population was working in industry, another 25% or so working in the services sector, and about 24% in agriculture. And so a pretty dramatic shift from a century before in which most of the population was working in agriculture, industry was small, services were small. A few notable things to point out here. First of all, the pace of change and scaling was actually relatively slow. It really took roughly 100 years for most of these inventions to really catch on and be adopted en masse by the population and by industries. And so they were slow to grow, slow to be adopted. The second bit is about life expectancy. It was about 40 years back in the 19th century, meaning given that many of these inventions took 100 years to be adopted, that's roughly 2.5 lifetimes. And so it's very possible that by the time a disrupting technology came along for a certain job function, that whoever was in that job was dead, or they no longer had a need for that kind of a person anyway. And lastly is this point about the skill sets, which is high-skilled jobs in artisan manufacturing were destroyed. Some other low-skilled jobs in agriculture and other areas were also destroyed. But they were replaced by lots of other low-skilled jobs, some high-skilled ones as well. But this meant that anybody could transition. If you lost your job, you wouldn't have an issue transitioning to these new opportunities. OK, so talking about today, what's happening today, again, I'll be quick at the history as best I can, but really a number of important developments over the past 60, 70 years that have made computers viable. The development of the transistor and microprocessor, new algorithms, the introduction of robotics on assembly lines, and then, of course, the digital revolution, which has made possible a lot of information technology inventions. But today, when I think of the fourth revolution, the thing that matters most, the two most important developments are first, the availability of data. We have now collected what we can call a critical mass of data that can actually be used to train very advanced artificial intelligence algorithms. And in the past, we just simply did not have the amount of data to create relatively low error rate algorithms. But today, we finally do. And I think the translation algorithms are a great example of this, where all of a sudden, a few years ago, these algorithms that had been designed in the 70s and 80s to translate text started functioning much better than they ever had in the past. It's because they had enough data to actually better train the algorithms. The second big invention, or we can call adoption or development, is the graphical processing unit. This is usually used in video games and to play video games. And what happened was it was actually adopted by a lot of these artificial intelligence industries to power deep learning artificial intelligence techniques. And GPUs have roughly 10 times, if not more, the processing power of traditional chips, which means far greater volumes of data can actually be analyzed and processed. And we can actually apply deep learning methodology to those data sets to gain better insight. Again, like the Industrial Revolution, this has had a pretty big impact on jobs. This right here just shows the manufacturing employment in the US since about 1980. Again, this is when robotics that were powered by algorithms really started to be used on US assembly lines at the time. And you can see a pretty big drop from about 20 million Americans employed in agriculture, in manufacturing in 1980 to today. It's about 12 million. It's a pretty huge, about a 40% drop, I believe. Pretty huge drop. At the same time, we estimate that robotics will continue to eliminate jobs in the future. The World Economic Forum, they predict that roughly 5 million jobs in 15 countries will disappear by 2020 as a result of robotics. And it's also having downward pressure on wages. A recent report is written up in the New York Times by Darren Acemoglu at the National Bureau of Economic Research basically found that for every new robot per 1,000 people in a given geographic area, wages were depressed by 0.25 to 0.5%. So there was some evidence that robotics are eliminating jobs and they are pushing down wages. However, again, there's a bright side of this as well, creating lots of jobs. Artificial intelligence requires people to program it. It requires people to maintain the algorithms, to train them, to make sure they're operating as designed over time. These are pretty high skill, high paying jobs that are really important, and we're creating lots of them. Robotics as well. I mean, even though robotics are replacing humans on assembly lines, you still need people to oversee those assembly lines. You need people to maintain the robotics equipment. You need people to troubleshoot any problem that may arise during the assembly process. And again, big data, also very important here. You need to be able to intake that data. You need to be able to manage it, to process it, to pull insight out from it. All of that requires people doing a lot of this work that's not as easy for a machine to do. A few stats here about the number of jobs that will be created. Both Gartner and Deloitte expect that more jobs are being created as a result of these innovations than are being destroyed. There's also this other side to it that I think is very interesting, which is that these technologies are often complementing work. They're not eliminating jobs, they're not entirely new jobs, they're actually making our existing jobs easier. A good example is medicine. People talk about radiologists as being a career that is at risk from automation, but a lot of the early evidence suggests that it's actually helping to make radiologists much better at their jobs. Artificial intelligence helps to better diagnose some complex diseases. It helps to pull in information from different sources, and it helps radiologists to prioritize treatment for different patients. Other areas, journalism, graphic design, and filmmaking, there's all these applications for artificial intelligence that actually help humans do their job a bit better, and really it helps humans to spend less time on the boring, dull, monotonous work and focus on more of the creative, strategic, challenging work that we're really best at doing. A few similarities here with the Industrial Revolution and what's happening today. Destruction of industries and jobs, but creation of new ones. The cost of goods has been reduced. 20 years ago, the idea that a computer more powerful than anything that existed could fit into my pocket, no one would believe that would exist today, but it does, and many people can afford it. And lastly, it's really disrupting our lives. During the Industrial Revolution, there was this shift from people living in rural areas to now living in cities. And this is actually happening today, but differently. We're working differently. We're not as often in offices. We're engaging virtually with coworkers around the world. We use things like Slack or different types of video technologies to work in these virtual environments. And it's a very different kind of world. And I think we as humans are still struggling in many ways to adjust to this. Two big differences, though, and these are really important. The first is the pace of change. We're talking rapid adoption and scaling of technologies. Artificial intelligence, the way it's being deployed today, I think roughly 80% of companies are investing today in in artificial intelligence, at least in the US. I think 2 years ago that number was far lower. The fact of the matter is these new technologies are being adopted at an extremely rapid pace, and they're being scaled extremely rapidly. So even huge companies that usually are the last to adopt these technologies are not just using it, but they're using it at scale. The second big difference is the skills gap. Again, in the past, low-skilled jobs and high-skilled jobs were destroyed, but lots of new low-skilled jobs that required no new retraining were created. Today, it's a very different story. We're destroying all kinds of jobs, but a lot of low-skilled jobs, especially those in manufacturing and transport. But the new jobs that are being created are very, very high skill. A person can overnight become a data scientist. A person can overnight become a robotics technician. These jobs are becoming really just very difficult for many employees to transition to. Okay, so this is what I call leading to what I call the crisis of the unemployables. Really what this is because this is a problem particularly acute in the US, but what's happening is that lots of low-skilled jobs are being destroyed, lots of high-skilled jobs are being created, and there's this class of people that cannot easily transition from the low-skilled jobs they lost to these new higher-skilled jobs. These are people often with high school or some sort of basic vocational education. They're in the middle of their careers, but they still have a long time left to work, so they can't really retire right away. They've got some experience in low-skilled or semi-skilled work. And what's happening is that they don't have the skills that are required in the new economy. And beyond that, they also don't really know how to acquire those skills. And this is, in the US, we have some education programs around this, but it's not always easy for a lot of people to figure out what they should invest in. Now, we think of automation and the kind of impact it's having an impact on kind of blue-collar workers, your people working in manufacturing, the people working in transportation or warehousing. But it's also affecting a lot of white-collar work. Again, financial services, a lot of back-office operations are being now performed by artificial intelligence algorithms. Same with accounting. Journalism, again, I talked about being a job that's complemented by artificial intelligence, but it's also under threat. Same with some medical jobs. And so a lot of the jobs that we used to think were very secure and which white-collar employees wouldn't have to worry about are really actually at risk now from automation. And then even really high-risk jobs. So data scientists, on average, make roughly $105,000 per year in the US. I think that's for an entry-level job. We think of this as one of the best careers in the future. People are pushed to becoming data scientists. But there's some evidence that that career itself, or at least some parts of that career, are actually at risk. Gartner predicts that 40% of these jobs will be automated by 2020. It's also highly possible there will be new kinds of data science jobs, but 40% of what is currently being done today can be automated. I think that's a really important point. And there's already companies that are actually doing this. Dev9 and DataRobot are both two really interesting companies that are actually writing software that lets anyone who's not a data scientist actually basically write their own software and code. So they can actually communicate with an artificial intelligence algorithm to write code to perform a task that normally a human would actually be required to do. So I still think this is a pretty good profession to be in, but it does show you that even these kinds of really safe jobs are actually at threat as well. And so the way I kind of think about this, though, is if you are young, even if you're in the middle of your career, the best way to approach career security is to think about how creative and how high skill your job is. The jobs that are at highest risk of being automated are these jobs at the bottom. Really anything that doesn't really require that much thinking. A person driving a car has to make a quick decision about whether to turn, to change lanes. But for the most part, there's not any complex thought processes there. These are the kinds of jobs that are at high risk of automation. These are the careers that should really be avoided. I don't think anyone in the room or on Periscope is at risk of this, but these are the kinds of jobs that are most likely to be automated. In the middle it's actually a very interesting group. This is the so-called middle skills job. There's actually a pretty big shortage of these jobs, of employees with these skills in the US. There's probably 1 million, maybe 2 million more jobs than there actually are employees to fill those roles. But these are really high-skill manufacturing jobs and robotics and maintenance. The US has not done a good job of training these people. At the top are the jobs that I think are the safest. These are highly technical jobs, like some of the more advanced data science jobs and engineering. These are jobs in management. It's not very easy for a machine to manage people. Subject matter experts as well. It's hard for a machine to develop the kind of contextual understanding of complex ideas that humans are really good at. Even lawyers, who are increasingly, people say, are at risk of automation, there's a lot of creativity in drafting legal cases. And so if you want to be safe and secure, I think really the best way to do it is to think about how creative is my job, how innately human is the work I'm doing. And that's really where this sweet spot is for I think, long-term career success. So just talk about two quick programs I think are really interesting as kind of case studies about how to address this crisis. The first is an apprenticeship program that's actually being done in the southern US, but by German and Austrian companies. And they realized in the mid-1990s they had a shortage of skilled workers in their factories. They needed people with really advanced manufacturing maintenance skills. And so they created this apprenticeship program in which they brought in students from a local high school, recruited them into this program, trained them for 4 years, including the last 2 years of high school and then 2 years beyond that, paid for all of this training, and then provided them with a guaranteed job at the end of it all for a $36,000 starting salary, which was pretty good for someone without a college degree. And the students as well are given a degree in applied sciences. And so the students get a lot of really valuable hands-on training, but also they have a job, and they actually have a really high retention rate. 80% of the students choose to stay with the company that trained them. This is a really good way of connecting this supply and demand issue where companies don't have the right kinds of workers, so they go straight to the supply and train that supply in these skills. Another is one that's being done in Denmark. I think a really interesting one, which is that in Denmark, they have this is a more higher level government program in which, they have relatively weak job protections, and so a person can be fired or hired pretty easily based on changing market conditions. What the government does, though, is that if a person loses their job, they're able to maintain about 60% of their former pay. And they're given the opportunity to enroll in these different job training programs and job seeking programs that the government works with companies and labor unions to design. And then in order for that person to maintain their employment benefits, they have to stay enrolled in those programs. So it's a really good way of getting job seekers the right skills they need and helping them to find the right job. And Denmark has, the last decade or so, one of the lowest jobless rates in the world, lower than the US. And job seekers there are actually pretty optimistic. When people lose their job, they're almost always very pessimistic and aren't certain they'll find another job. But the Danes are actually pretty positive. 70% saying that they are optimistic they'll find a new job is a pretty big deal. So lastly, what I want to talk about is, what do I think the future looks like? How do you succeed today? And really 3 important things to keep in mind. The first is that machines really are not quite adept at those innately human things. They're not as creative as humans. They have a hard time grasping the context of different situations. Any kind of job function that really depends on those innately human characteristics or behaviors, I think are going to be the safest. So jobs that are creative, and you can have lots of creative jobs in artificial intelligence and in data science, but anything that's very rote and manual, you probably want to avoid. So it could provide you with good skills in the short term, but you want to focus on jobs that really require you to think creatively about whatever the problem or the task at hand is you're dealing with. I think secondly, it's very, very important for students to be, or for really anyone, students, young employees, anyone who wants to get into this field, to be willing to work with machines. Machines are really complementing a lot of the work that we're doing. And often those that will be best positioned to succeed in the future are those that know how to work with machines, work alongside artificial intelligence algorithms or robotics, whatever it might be. Those that resist these changes are going to be the first ones to be out of work. I think lastly is a stat here I think is really important. This is a McKinsey estimate that says by 2030, this is looking worldwide, but mostly at OECD countries, roughly 75 to 375 million people will need to shift their job functions, new careers, right? And so think about what you're doing today. Imagine if the job you had today didn't exist. You're going to have to find a new job. And so I think it's really important for people to continuously develop their own skill set. So get more education, learn different skills. If you're working within a company, try and do different functions within that company. Maybe it's marketing, or maybe it's data science, maybe it's sales, maybe it's operations. But being able to learn these new skills is very critical to succeeding in the future. And also treating education as a continuous improvement process. You're not just educating yourself once, you're not going to school once and then you're done forever and you're in a career, but try and educate yourself throughout your career. So personally, I don't know, I've got some pretty good data analysis skills, but I'm not a coder. But I'm trying to learn languages like Python and R because maybe I don't need them now, but maybe in 10 or 20 years, I actually might need these skills. And so being open-minded to learning or expanding your educational horizons and learning new skills, I think will be really important for people to remain successful in the future. And so with that, a little over, I suppose, but pretty close.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. You really kept it 25 minutes. You know, when you tell speakers 25 minutes, they go 45 minutes, then you start like doing the cough or something that you know that they went over time. Well, thank you so much. There was a lot of information. First of all, can we share these slides with our colleagues?
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you for that. So let me open, before I open it up for questions from my colleagues, let me ask you this. So you gave us this crisis of unemployables, as you called it.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of other people called it as well. But we're in the business of education. We're dealing with students. We're dealing with lots of parents, particularly with parents. So how should we develop, or how should we talk to them about the expectations that they have of higher education for their children? Because if I recall, when I was going to college, it was pretty straightforward. Booz, you're gonna go to college, you're gonna major in this and this, and then you're gonna come out, you're gonna get this job, and this is how it works. What you're telling me is by the time I entered college as a young student, or a 18-year-old, by the time till I finished that in 4 years, some of those jobs that have been created could be destroyed.
Yeah.
So what do we do?
The hardest question to start with, I think. I think it's really important to treat college as, you know, an education in multiple areas. I mean, on one hand, you want to learn technical skills. You want to develop your math skills. Math is useful, is always going to be useful in many ways, whether it's in mathematics, physics, engineering, or data science. And so you're learning some really important skills that are applicable in different areas. But I think it's also really important in the college experience that you're in an environment in which your ideas are tested against others. And you don't really have that experience just by reading a book. When you're in a college classroom, you can, you know, raise your hand to ask questions about different ideas and challenge your own thinking and challenge other people's thinking. And so to me, it's very much about this kind of immersive experience, which really, you know, challenges people to think critically and creatively about different types of problems. And maybe it's in subjects that are completely different than what you may end up in a career. But those skills, that critical thinking and that kind of how do you test ideas out and how do you make sure they're sound and that they are reasonable, that process really is applicable to any industry, and I think really important. And it's hard to get that in places that aren't a college environment.
You know, let me follow up on that. Let me press you on this issue. So I have a student, and the student is about to go to college in the U.S. And he or she is doing very well, going to a very good school. But as education institutions, and looking at the education system that we have, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, is kind of broken for this new, those two criteria that you talked about. One was the pace of change. The other one is, if you will, the job or the skill sets that are not matching with today's demand or future demand. So how can I help those students? What should I be telling those students? How can I be an extension of the university degree that they're gonna get in order to make sure that these individuals, not only that they're graduating with successful grades, but also they're really adaptable, flexible, and as you say, they're going to be very successful workers with that creativity, that technology, collaborative work, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about the development of soft skills and being able to work with different groups of people effectively. The reality is a lot of work is group-based. You're not going to be working by yourself, and so being able to work as part of a team, and those soft skills I think are really important to learn, and for some people it's harder than others. You know, developing leadership skills as well is also really important. What was your second part of your question?
Well, the second part of the question is, actually, there was all one question, but the fact of the matter is, what do we do? What's our obligation as educators, as part of that education process? Because majority of these students that are coming to us, they come with a tremendous amount of aspiration. Mm-hmm. But once they graduate from college, the question is, the job market is much more challenging than what they expected. And it is not their fault. It is not our fault. But how do we get them gradually ready in this process? What are the things that we should do to be a successful, unique education company, to be able to make sure that our clients, our students are not only just ending up in great companies, but no matter where you drop them, they're going to be extremely successful.
So, I mean, part of it obviously is preparing them to get that first job. That's the big first step. So making sure that students are pursuing the right kinds of activities while they're in college. There's lots of kinds of extracurricular activities that you can get involved with, but you don't want to overstretch yourself. Finding things that are meaningful. And I think a lot of students struggle with knowing really where to start and how to navigate that process. And then it's talking about your experiences on a resume. Writing a resume can be very challenging, especially when you think employers look at thousands of resumes per day. You want to make sure that your resume is structured well, that it speaks to your strengths effectively, that it makes sure that really you ultimately get matched with the right kind of a company that's good for your skills and good for your career. And then really just providing them, I think, with this general professional outlook of knowing that, in this day and age, no job is necessarily secure for the long term. And so make sure that, whatever job you're in, you're at the top, you're at the head of the pack, really, that you're really the person that is always doing things to push themselves, to be better, to make sure that you're kind of the tip of the sword, so to speak. It's a very, unfortunately, I think the education system in the U.S. is, as you said, really struggling to adapt to a lot of these changes. But I think it's really important for students to learn how to really position themselves and how to market themselves to different types of employers.
Mm-hmm. You talked about development of soft skills. You're right. I think you are a very good example of that. You coming out of undergrad, going to a very good graduate school, but you also learning and constantly learning, whether programming languages such as Python and others, but you're also really developing that soft skills, dealing with a lot of clients in your consulting work already. So with that, let me open it up. Do we have any questions here or online? Anybody?
Yeah.
I was just going to ask, with regard to the sort of rapid rate at which we are adapting to new trends in technology leading into the crisis of unemployment that you talked about, do you foresee some way in which that process either reverses or slows down?
I don't think it's going to reverse. It could slow down. It's possible that what will happen is that there will be rapid adoption of AI technologies, and a lot of them will not work out the way a lot of companies expect them to. And so there'll be a bit of hesitancy on many companies to adopt certain technologies, which could slow things down a little bit. But the reality is the amount of data that we're able to collect now is just increasing every year. As a statistic, for example, when 2017 ends on December 31st, we will have collected more data in just this year than all of prior human history. Meaning 2016 and every year prior to it combined, we had collected less data than today. And so that data is really useful in powering artificial intelligence algorithms, with deep learning and GPUs especially, which means that these tools are going to get better and better and better at doing things that humans are doing. And so in no way do I see it reversing, but I can see a reluctance among some companies to adopt them if they have, hit some bumps in the road going forward. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. So I know you have a lot of experience consulting with companies. So WholeRen also have an arm that does executive education.
Mm-hmm.
And help a lot of industrial corporations. So from a company standpoint of view, I did hear you in two dimensions. One is to adopt new technology into production processes and R&D. The other one is training and retraining their talents. So for the first dimension, say for example, our clients, their biggest steel makers in China, they have already achieved touchless product lines.
Mm-hmm.
But what are the other companies that you would recommend them to look at? What are the other dimensions they could further adopt new technology into their process?
Thank you.
And the other dimension is, you mentioned about apprentice programs, which are very interesting to train high-tech people to fill the skill gaps. So they also have technical college in China, which is 4-year program from high school to college. So what are the do you have more information to share on that dimension for them to further enhance their corporate trainings for technical talents?
Sure. So I'll start with the second question around the technical stuff.
Right.
I think it's really about connecting supply with demand. In the U.S., we have lots of technical training. There are all kinds of vocational programs out there, but they don't seem to be training people in the skills that companies actually need. And so I think the really important thing is that somebody has to play a role in connecting the actual technical skills that are in demand by companies with the people that want to learn those skills. So I think the Apprenticeship 2000 program is a really good example of that. Denmark is a really good example where they work with companies closely to actually understand what are the kind of skill sets you need in your jobs and in your industry, and then they actually create training programs and train workers in those skills. So I think the more cooperation you have between businesses, between companies, labor unions, as well as the government, more of that you have occur is going to help to really better ensure that you train the right people in the right skills. And can you just remind, your first question was about what else besides like manufacturing where you're seeing?
Right, how could they further adopt new technology into their manufacturing process? Do you have some leading company that are doing really well in this dimension?
Are you saying with manufacturing or?
Right, manufacturing process.
So right now, a lot of assembly line manufacturing, again, as we said, is being replaced by robotics. But there's often still humans who are overseeing the assembly line itself, or there are humans playing different roles when it comes to assessing the performance of the machines themselves. And so what you're actually seeing is that artificial intelligence tools are being used to determine when different machines are most likely to have problems. And in some places, they can actually have the machine fix itself, or robots basically come in and correct the problems on the machine. So you're almost developing robots that have designs that are easy to maintain by a non-human. And so a lot of the maintenance that's being done by humans right now in robotics is really important, but people are actually building assembly lines around not just having robots perform those processes, but making sure they're able to be serviced by other robots themselves. I mean, there's even some really cool technologies out there that are very, very nascent, but there's some where robots can actually change their shape, so it's kind of a modular design where this is really, really early technology that I think some work being done at MIT. But a robot the way it's built, it can change its shape to work better in different environments. And so you can imagine maybe having a maintenance robot on an assembly line that could adjust its shape to get into certain places where it might be tighter spaces or to reach higher areas, whatever it might be. I mean, I think when it comes to the manufacturing itself, most of the gains have been achieved. When it comes to moving to automation, I think a lot of the other gains are going to be more of the white collar functions around assessing the performance of assembly line robotics and identifying when problems may occur. Yeah.
So traditionally in education, you're taught to, when you go into your undergrad, you're supposed to find out what your talents are, what your skills are, and go towards whatever major that serves, right? And you're supposed to excel at one thing. Right? That's the traditional aspect of education right now, and higher education specifically. Do you think that universities and colleges need to do a better job of integrating those two different prospective colleges within the universities?
Yeah, I think so. The problem is you could be great at something, but there could either be no career in that field or it could be obsolete in 5 years. What I think universities need to focus on, a couple of things, I think one of which is a flexible, creative, critical thinking skill set. And it's interesting because the last few years, in the US especially, but I think abroad as well, the value of a liberal arts education has been discounted. And people say, you should go and just study engineering or just study mathematics or physics, that's so useful. But liberal arts teaches you how to think critically about problems. It teaches you how to take into account different perspectives and the things you don't know about. And so if anything, I would say universities should go back towards that, but still also provide the avenue for students to pursue more technical pursuits or things they're really good at. So make sure you learn about history and calculus and whatever else it might be, political science, English. These things are all really important, I think, to succeed in a modern world. Communication is really important, but at the same time, like, that doesn't mean you're not free to go study engineering. And then the person that, if you can bring those two skill sets together, you have a person who has the technical ability that they're very good at, but also with more of those critical thinking skills that I think are really critical to succeed. I mean, when I showed this, like, you could call this critical thinking, this scale. You know, the more critical thinking skills you have, I think the more successful you'll be and the more insulated from disruption you'll be. Yeah.
In China, because in the past 25, 30 years, there are so many families accumulated wealth. So because of family tradition in China, they always think about how they can do for their kids. They worry a lot about, there's a common term in there about the jumping in social economic status, 层级跳跃. So to not from the new rich to have their kids to be better in the next generation. So that's why a lot of the Chinese parents are worried. But since the kids, a lot of them are single child and from a very commercialized environment.
Mm-hmm.
So are there any advice, or are there anything you can give advice on how the parents, what would be the better way for the parents to better ensure their kids can live a better life than they are, if money is not the object? So what should they do?
I think it's really important to find ways to get their kids to learn to be independent to start. You know, I have friends here in the U.S. who are only children. You compare their experience to people who have a few brothers and sisters, and always the only child gets so much attention from the parents and a lot of help. And so I think it's really important to think about, having your children go to high school abroad, or even just out of a city different from their own, because it at least gives them the opportunity to learn to be more independent from their parents. I think parents have to be willing to take away maybe some of the financial cushion they give some of their children. I think a lot of parents, it's very tough. You've got children, you really care about them, and you want them to succeed, but oftentimes the best recipe for success for the long term is really teaching your kids that they have to do things on their own, that their parents won't always be there to provide all the financial benefits they need. Getting their children to engage with other people outside their family or their immediate social network. And so learning how to operate in different environments. How do you, networking with different groups of people, or attending group meetings on subjects that might be interesting with people that you don't know at all. I think these things should be encouraged. Really, anything that gets your kid out of their comfort zone, I think, is really important to making sure that they're successful over the long term. Does that answer? Sure.
Okay, in your presentation, you talk about the power of data, or big data, or machine learning.
Mm-hmm.
So, in your opinion, how to use machine learning or big data or any other fancy technology in our industry, in the international education industry, to help us expand our market share?
So I think you could use these technologies to really improve customer service. So right now, customer service is very much individual. I'm a customer and I will engage with a customer service representative. That can be, sometimes you might have a rep who doesn't really know exactly how to answer the person's questions. You can use AI tools to assist you in basically answering their questions more effectively. But I think in the future, you can have that individual engage with a chatbot that's basically artificial intelligence powered chatbot that can answer all their questions more effectively. The person won't know that it's a chatbot. I've engaged with these and I didn't know. They've gotten really good lately. But that customer can get their question answered much faster, much more effectively, and it actually frees up the customer service representatives to deal with the really more complex issues that may arise. So all the people that call you that have really small questions or problems, you can let a machine handle that problem. Let the AI do that for you. But when someone has a really big issue, you have the full devotion of a person who can stop what they're doing with everything else and focus on that customer's individual issues. I think that's one way. I mean, there's all kinds of other ways around, sales and marketing that can really be used. But I think to me, I think of how do you better engage with customers, and I think that's a really powerful tool.
So let me just ask a flyer question. So the previous three industrial revolutions are roughly 60 years apart, and they have a clear starting and ending point for each revolution. So which starting point would you predict for the fourth evolution, and what would be the ending point, would you say? And can you foresee the fifth one?
Yeah. So the starting point, mid to late 2000s, it's really hard to say. I mean, I think the data is a critical element here. And so when did we get enough data that we could start creating good machine learning algorithms? We've been collecting data for decades, but there's a point at which it went from a trickle to now we have enough that we can actually do something with it. So I think early 2000s probably makes sense. The problem is that we could argue that the prior revolution, the digital one, we're still actually in the middle of it, which is kind of where we have these two distinct revolutions that are overlapping. As far as how long it'll go for, that's a big question. This is really a question about the fifth revolution. I don't know if they will be distinct. The big next step for me that I see, and I don't know that we'll get there, I think we probably will, it's a matter of time, is generalized artificial intelligence, which means today artificial intelligence is very good at doing specific tasks. It can translate language. It can oversee maybe a robotics assembly line and diagnose where problems are. But you can't go up to, you can't maybe create a robot and say, can you go drive me to work? And now can you also help review my resume to make sure it makes sense? And can we have just a conversation with a robot? Like that kind of general things that like what we call generalized AI, which is really like looking much more like what a human actually is. That to me is the big next step. I think it's potentially very terrifying because it maybe means that we won't be able to differentiate between machines and humans. Machines might do everything and we might be all out of work or living a life of leisure, who knows. But that to me is the big next step. That would be the fifth revolution. I don't know when it'll occur. It could be anywhere from 20 years from now to 100 or even sooner. It's a lot of questions that a lot of people much smarter than me can't answer either. So I'm not gonna commit too much to that. But I think that's the big next step, though.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Emily, and you keep mentioning you training yourself. You keep mentioning continuous training in your career path. And then you even mentioned you're training yourself for some like coding skills. That's really interesting. I would like to know how would you suggest from the employer standpoint, how would you suggest our company to train our employees to keep the future successful? Our company has trained the teenagers for robotics camps. Like 10 days before in here, we gather like 30 kids in here to learn how to make a robotics or programming skill. How would you how would you suggest our company to train our employees? Maybe we should train ourselves robotics skills, something
Sure.
like that.
So I think it can be really valuable to do trainings on just what your actual job function is. So if you're working in marketing, it's really helpful to learn different types of marketing and train yourself on, or to get training on different types of marketing skills and methodologies. I mean, just that specifically can be very useful. It can be also useful to train each other within the organization about different job functions. So how do you manage projects or teams? There's actually formalized trainings you can do. And then, I mean, it's a bigger question, which is how useful or who, training people on how to code can be very expensive, but it can be very beneficial. And so I think some of that can be interesting. I mean, I think within a company itself, it's really useful to think about what do you want to get out of your employees? How can you make their jobs easier, make them better, help them to grow, and focus on what those skills are. I know it's kind of a soft answer, but for companies themselves, it is, it's a bit different. Now, for an individual, to me, the way I think about like my life, I just like to learn about different things in general. So I talked about learning Python. But I also love to learn, I'm starting to learn about like genetics just by reading books on genetics. And it's a subject that I know nothing about prior to reading about this. And I have to learn about this new subject, which conditions my mind to always be ready to learn new skills. It makes sure that I can absorb things really well and apply things. And so just being open to learning new things, and it can be whatever you want, really. You can go and get a physics textbook and try and teach yourself physics. You may not become an expert, you might not even get good at it, but that process of trying to force yourself to learn is something that I think we tend to stop doing when we finish college, and I think it's completely the wrong approach. And so, think about it might be what you like, things that are interesting to you. I think from an individual level, it's very important to be open to learning new things. Employers, I think, can focus on improving the skills of their employees in their areas and cross-sharing skills and maybe learning new things that might be relevant, such as some coding. But I really think a lot of this is on the individual to be open to learning new skills, because learning itself is a skill, if you really think about it that way. And it's a really valuable skill, maybe the most valuable skill I think that we have.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. So let me, we had a very serious conversation, crisis, unemployables, this and that. What do you do for fun? What do you do to clear your head? Because every time I think about all these things, frankly, I get a little bit paranoid about what this future is going to look like. So what else does Aaron Goldblatt do? What do you do that's not related to necessarily learning about genetics or artificial intelligence? And why do you do that, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, so I love to cook. I love to cook. I like to eat good food. I think that's the main reason why I like to cook. But I love to cook. I love to try new foods. And so I live in Washington, D.C. It's a pretty international place, but sometimes there's a cuisine you can't get, and I read about something and it sounds really delicious, and so I want to make that. So I like just trying new foods. I like kind of slaving over a hot stove. My mother was a great cook. I think that's kind of my close connection with her, as we would cook together when I was younger. I like also that if you want, this is, I guess I'm sounding too nerdy here, but a lot of cooking is very scientific, and so I kind of like that element of how to cook the perfect egg, and exactly how many minutes should you let it boil, and at what temperature, and kind of silly things like that. I just enjoy it. I think it's like, I want to make the best food possible, and I will go to extreme ends to make that happen.
So if I become a data scientist, I can be a good chef too.
Exactly.
There's a possibility.
Exactly.
Okay, as long as we make that clear. Well, first of all, thank you so much. Before I close, you and I briefly talked about China a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And you also spoke about your father spending some time in China on various educational trips. He's a medical professional.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that, because
Sure.
I want our people to learn about to know about it as well.
Sure. So my father is a pulmonologist, which is like a lung and breathing doctor. And he's now mostly retired from the U.S., but he's been, the last several years, he spent about 3 months per year in China, in Hangzhou, and a little bit of time in Fujian as well. But he's been training Chinese doctors on Western methods of medicine. So using kind of the Western approach towards treating different patients differently and trying to bring in as much information and applying evidence-based care ideas to the patient. And I think this is fascinating in China because the country, there's so many people and it's aging very rapidly. And so I think the medical system is really trying to make sure that they can give the best care possible. And so he's really enjoyed it. He's been back and forth multiple times. And I think they seem to really love having him there. And they took him out to hot pot, and I think he was sweating the whole time. And but overall, I think he's doing really great work trying to spread just best practices in medicine to other parts of the world.
Very good. For Aaron, first of all, I want to thank you. Thank you for coming to Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
I know this is your second time in Pittsburgh, and I hope you come here more often. Aaron is going to be with us tomorrow as well. He's going to be interacting with our groups, with everyone in the group, so feel free to actually go to him, ask him any questions that you might have. Once again, thank you so much for coming. We learned a lot, and thank you for letting us have this PowerPoint presentation as well. And I know you're working on a book.
Kind of.
All right. Will you tell us what is this anything with the unemployables?
Maybe.
Okay, all right, very good. Okay, you're not going to tell us that. Anyways, once again, thank you so much. Great to have you here, and looking forward to many more interactions.
Yeah,
thank you.
same here. Thanks.